I was Carolyn Tate, a 55-year-old history professor, proud of my intellect and unshakable belief in logic. Faith, heaven, sin, those were fairy tales for the gullible. My world was neatly ordered until the night I died. For 8 minutes, I left this life, and what I saw shattered every certainty I held. I met voices from the past, souls my family had wronged, and they weren't just stories, they were alive, crying out for justice. I came back changed, no longer a skeptic, but a woman desperate to right the wrongs that had cursed us for generations. The night it all began, I was racing against time. My lecture, the kind that made me feel alive, was set to start in less than an hour, and I was running late. I was used to being in control, juggling schedules, lectures, and a steady stream of debates about history and culture. Faith, spirituality, God. These were nothing more than relics of the human imagination, as far as I was concerned. If you couldn't prove it, it didn't exist. That's what I taught my students, and that's what I believed. But that night, my carefully constructed world started to crack. The tension in my chest wasn't just from rushing. It came from the argument with my daughter, Emily, earlier that afternoon. She'd called me cold, distant, even arrogant. She said I was blind to the possibility of something greater than myself. "You don't even try to listen, Mom," she said, her voice shaking. "You think you know everything, but you don't." I laughed it off at the time, brushing aside her frustration. It wasn't the first time we'd fought over her newfound faith, and I was certain it wouldn't be the last. Driving through the rain-soaked streets, her words echoed in my mind, louder than the drumming of water against the windshield. I'd planned to call her back after the lecture, maybe even apologize. But then my phone buzzed with a voicemail notification, and her name flashed on the screen. Something in me twisted, a mix of guilt and the nagging suspicion that she was right. I reached for the phone, a moment of distraction, and then everything went black. The impact was violent, jarring me into a silence, so complete it felt like the world had stopped spinning. I don't remember pain. I don't remember fear. I only remember opening my eyes to find myself somewhere else. At first, it was dark, but not the kind of darkness that hides things. This was a vast, open void, filled with whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As my senses adjusted, the space around me began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter and more vivid. I wasn't in a void at all. I was in a massive, endless library. The shelves stretched into infinity, crammed with books that seemed to pulse with light. The air buzzed with an energy I couldn't explain. I wasn't alone. There was a presence, though I couldn't see it at first. The whispers grew louder, resolving into voices, each one distinct, yet blending into a haunting harmony. They spoke of lives lived and lost, of pain and joy, of secrets buried and truths forgotten. It was overwhelming, and I clutched my head, trying to shut them out. "Stop," I screamed, my voice trembling. And just like that, the whispers ceased. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and indistinct, wrapped in light that seemed to shift and shimmer. It didn't speak, but its presence filled the space with a gravity that rooted me to the spot. When it finally addressed me, its voice wasn't a sound, but a vibration that reverberated through my entire being. "You are part of a chain," it said, each word heavy with meaning, "bound by sins you've ignored." "I don't understand," I stammered, my voice small in the vastness of the space. "What sins? I've done nothing wrong." The figure didn't reply. Instead, a book floated from one of the shelves, glowing brighter as it approached. When it stopped in front of me, I saw my family name etched on the cover, Tate. My stomach clenched, and my hands shook as I reached for it. The moment my fingers touched the cover, the world around me dissolved, pulling me into the pages. I was no longer in a library. I was on a plantation, the air thick with the scent of earth and sweat. The scene played out as if I were a ghost, invisible but painfully aware. A man I recognized from faded family photographs, my great-grandfather, stood on a porch, watching as enslaved men and women worked in the fields. He was stoic, detached, his hands clasped behind his back. But then the scene shifted. darkening like a storm rolling in. I saw the same man, older now, standing silent as a young black boy was dragged away by a mob. The boy screamed, begging for mercy, but my great grandfather turned his back, walking away as if he hadn't heard a thing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I screamed at him to stop, to intervene. But the scene continued as if I weren't there. The mob's cries faded, replaced by the haunting harmony of the voices I'd heard before. They swirled around me, each one cutting into my soul. Why did they not see us? Why did they not hear us? Why did they not care? I didn't know. I whispered, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know. You carry their burden, the figure said, its voice returning as the plantation dissolved back into the glowing library. The sins of your ancestors are written in a chain that binds you. If you do not restore what was stolen, the chain will tighten until it consumes you. I was trembling, my breath shallow. What do you mean? Restore what? How? I don't even know where to start. The figure moved closer, and for the first time, I felt its warmth, like standing near fire on a cold night. The answers lie within you, and within those you have ignored. Listen to the choir. They will guide you. Before I could ask anything else, the light around me intensified, and I felt myself being pulled backward, as if a rope were yanking me from the library. The whispers grew fainter, and the glowing shelves blurred into nothingness. I woke up in a hospital bed, gasping for air as alarms blared and nurses swarmed around me. My chest ached, and my throat was raw, but the memory of what I'd seen burned brighter than any physical pain. It wasn't a dream. It couldn't have been. I had been somewhere else, somewhere beyond anything I'd ever imagined. The figure's words echoed in my mind as I lay there, too weak to move. Restore what was stolen. But how could I, a woman who had spent her life denying the very existence of God or anything beyond the material world, begin to fix a legacy of sins I hadn't even known existed? The voices weren't done with me, though. I knew that much. They had started something, and deep down, I knew there was no turning back. I woke up in a haze, the beeping of machines and the muffled voices of nurses tethering me to the reality of the hospital room. My chest burned with every shallow breath, and my body ached as if I'd been pulled back from the edge of something vast and unknowable. But none of that mattered compared to the weight pressing down on my soul. My head swam with fragments of the vision, glimpses of the plantation, the anguished cries of the boy, and the figure's grave words about the sins of my ancestors. They weren't fading like a bad dream or a hallucination should. They clung to me, vivid and unshakable. The doctor came in not long after I regained consciousness, his voice calm but clipped with clinical detachment. You were gone for 8 minutes, he said, almost as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. Cardiac arrest caused by trauma from the crash. It's a miracle you're alive. A miracle. The word made my skin crawl. Miracles belong to the world of faith, of hope, of divine intervention, things I had always dismissed as comforting lies. And yet, here I was alive, when by all logic, I shouldn't be. I didn't tell the doctor what I'd seen. How could I? Even I didn't understand it. The days that followed were a blur of recovery, but the visions didn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that library, surrounded by the weight of countless lives whispering their truths into my ears. They weren't dreams, not in the way dreams are fleeting and nonsensical. These were memories, raw, vivid, undeniable. They followed me, even when I was awake. I started to hear faint whispers, just at the edge of perception, like an old radio trying to tune into a distant station. At first, I tried to ignore them, clinging to my rational mind. Trauma does strange things to the brain, I told myself. Stress, oxygen deprivation, it's all explainable. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. One afternoon, as I lay in the hospital bed, I decided to call Emily. My hands shook as I dialed her number, the memory of our fight gnawing at me. She picked up on the second ring, her voice cautious. Mom, are you okay? I'm fine. I lied, though nothing felt fine. I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you, for not listening. There was a pause, and I could hear the surprise in her voice when she replied, "It's okay, Mom. I know you don't believe in what I believe, but it's not about that. I just wanted you to care." Her words hit harder than she realized. I wanted to tell her what had happened, about the figure, the voices, and the overwhelming sense that I was part of something much bigger than myself. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I promised her I would try to be better, though even I didn't know what that meant. The real breaking point came a few nights after I was discharged from the hospital. I was back home, alone in the silence of my house. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and I started to see things, fleeting shadows in the corners of rooms, reflections in the mirror that weren't my own. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. But then, while going through a box of old family photographs, I picked up a faded black and white picture of a group of workers standing in front of a barn. The moment my fingers brushed the edge of the photo, the world shifted. I wasn't in my living room anymore. I was back on the plantation, standing in the middle of a dirt path lined with wooden shacks. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat and earth, and the sky above was a muted gray, as if the light itself had been dulled. I saw the young boy again, the one from my earlier vision. He couldn't have been more than 12, his clothes tattered and his face streaked with tears. He was running, his bare feet kicking up clouds of dust as he fled from a group of men shouting after him. I tried to move, to intervene, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, forced to watch as the boy was caught and dragged to the ground. The men's faces were obscured, but their voices were clear, angry, cruel, unyielding. One of them turned to look in my direction, and for a moment, I thought he could see me. It was my great grandfather. He said nothing, simply standing there as the boy was taken away. His silence was as loud as a scream, and I felt it like a dagger to my heart. The vision faded, and I was back in my living room, the photograph still clutched in my hand. My breaths came in shallow gasps, and tears streamed down my face. I couldn't deny it anymore. Whatever was happening to me wasn't just in my head. The sins of my family were real, and they were demanding to be acknowledged. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up, digging through the box of photos and old documents, piecing together fragments of my family's history. The deeper I went, the darker the story became. Records of a plantation in the deep South, letters that hinted at the mistreatment of workers, and cryptic notes about relocating undesirables. My family's legacy was one of wealth built on exploitation and suffering, and I had been blind to it all my life. But the visions weren't done with me. As I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of my ancestors, I felt the now familiar pull, and the whispers grew louder. This time, they didn't wait for me to fall asleep. They invaded my waking mind, their voices a cacophony of pain and accusation. "You must restore what was stolen," they said. "You must see us." The figure from the library appeared again, its form shimmering in the dim light of the room. "You know the truth now," it said, its voice calm but unyielding. "But knowing is not enough. You must act." "How?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How can I fix something that happened so long ago?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it pointed to the box of documents in front of me. "The answers lie there. Listen to the voices. Follow them." Before I could say anything else, it vanished, leaving me alone with the weight of what I had uncovered. I knew there was no turning back now. Whatever this journey was, it had only just begun. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by anyone in the physical world, but by something unseen, always just out of reach. The whispers had become a near constant presence, their tone shifting from mournful to urgent, pressing me to act. But act on what? The pile of documents and photos in front of me felt like a puzzle with no clear picture. My family's legacy was a mess of dates, locations, and half-buried truths. And then there was the figure's command: restore what was stolen. It echoed in my mind like a riddle I didn't know how to solve. I decided to start with the tangible. There was an address mentioned repeatedly in the letters I'd found, a plantation in Georgia, Tate Manor, once owned by my great-grandfather. The idea of going there filled me with dread, but I couldn't ignore the pull. If the answers were anywhere, they were there. It was a long drive, and the further south I went, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if the past itself was pressing down on me. When I finally arrived, the sight of the place stopped me in my tracks. Tate Manor was nothing like the grand estate I had imagined. The house was crumbling, its once pristine columns streaked with mildew, and its windows clouded with grime. The surrounding fields, which had likely once been meticulously maintained, were overgrown with weeds. It was a haunting reminder of a legacy left to rot, and yet, standing there, I could feel the weight of what had happened on this land. The whispers grew louder, their tone sharper, almost accusing. I wandered the grounds, unsure of what I was looking for, but driven by an instinct I couldn't explain. As I approached the edge of the property, I noticed a small, overgrown cemetery hidden behind a cluster of trees. The gravestones were weathered, their inscriptions barely legible, but one in particular caught my eye. It was a simple marker, unadorned and unremarkable, but as I brushed away the dirt covering its surface, I felt a rush of cold air and a sharp pain in my chest. The name on the stone was Samuel. The moment I read it, the world around me seemed to shift. I was no longer in the overgrown cemetery, but back in the library, surrounded by the voices of the forgotten. This time, they were louder, their pain more palpable. The figure appeared again, its form more distinct now, almost human, but its face remained obscured. Samuel, it said, the name carrying a weight that made my knees buckle. His story was stolen, his voice silenced. You must listen. The scene around me changed, and I was thrust into another vision. I saw Samuel as a young boy, the same one from my earlier visions. He was working in the fields, his hands raw and blistered, his face a mask of quiet determination. But as the vision unfolded, I saw the horrors he endured: beatings, starvation, and, ultimately, betrayal. He had trusted my great-grandfather, believing his promises of protection, only to be handed over to a mob when it became convenient. The betrayal was more than personal. It was systemic, part of a cycle of cruelty that had been perpetuated for generations. When the vision ended, I was back in the cemetery, gasping for air. The whispers had quieted, but the weight of what I'd seen lingered. Samuel wasn't just a victim. He was a thread in the fabric of my family's history, a life stolen to protect a legacy of power and privilege. And now, that thread was unraveling, demanding to be acknowledged. I left the cemetery with a new sense of purpose. I didn't know exactly what restoring what was stolen meant, but I knew it started with Samuel. I began researching him, combing through historical records and local archives. It wasn't easy. His story, like so many others, had been erased or buried. But with every scrap of information I uncovered, the picture became clearer. He had family, descendants who had been scattered and forgotten, just like him. The trail led me to a small town a few hours away, where I found a man named Elijah, a retired teacher who claimed to be Samuel's great-grandson. Meeting him was one of the most humbling experiences of my life. He didn't know much about Samuel, only fragments of stories passed down through his family, but he spoke of a deep pain, a sense of loss that had lingered for generations. We always felt like we were searching for something, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. Like a piece of us was missing. As I listened to him, I realized that restoring what was stolen wasn't just about acknowledging the past. It was about healing the wounds it had left behind. I shared what I had learned about Samuel, the truth of his life and his death, and together, we began to piece together a fuller picture of his story. Elijah's family had been denied not just justice, but the dignity of knowing where they came from, and I was determined to help change that. But the more I uncovered, the more resistance I faced. My own extended family, once I told them what I was doing, was furious. They accused me of dredging up the past for no reason, of trying to tarnish our family's name. You're digging where you shouldn't, one of my cousins said during a heated phone call. None of this is your responsibility. But it was. I couldn't explain it, not in terms they would understand, but I felt it in every fiber of my being. The whispers, the visions, the figure in the library, they weren't letting me walk away from this. I had to see it through, no matter the cost. The final breakthrough came when I found a diary belonging to my great grandfather, hidden among the old family papers I had brought back from the plantation. In it, he wrote about Samuel and the decisions he had made, his guilt, his fear, and ultimately his choice to protect himself at Samuel's expense. It was a damning confession, but it was also a key to understanding the full scope of what had happened. With Elijah's help, I arranged a memorial for Samuel, a public acknowledgement of his life and the injustice he had suffered. It was a small ceremony, held in the cemetery where I had first found his grave, but it was powerful. As I stood there, surrounded by Elijah's family and a handful of others who had come to honor Samuel's memory, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in weeks. The whispers, for the first time, were silent. But I knew this wasn't the end. The figure's words still echoed in my mind. You are part of a chain. Samuel's story was just one link, and there were others still waiting to be uncovered. The journey was far from over, and the weight of it pressed heavily on me. But for the first time, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: hope. The weeks that followed Samuel's memorial felt like walking a tightrope between two worlds: the one I'd always known, grounded in logic and history, and the one I could no longer deny, heavy with whispers and unseen forces. The peace I'd felt at the memorial was fleeting. The whispers returned, sharper and more insistent, pushing me toward something I couldn't yet see. The figure from the library haunted my dreams, its voice a low, steady pulse reminding me of the chain I was bound to. One link was restored, but it was far from complete. The unease followed me everywhere. I couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on anything but the growing sense that there was more to uncover. Late one night, while sifting through the documents from Tate Manor again, I found something I'd missed before: a receipt for the sale of land, dated just after Samuel's death. The name of the buyer leapt out at me: David Hensley, a local preacher. There was something chilling about the transaction. Why would my great-grandfather, a plantation owner, sell a piece of prime farmland to a preacher for next to nothing? The receipt felt like a thread waiting to be pulled, and I couldn't ignore it. I started digging into local records, following the trail of David Hensley. It didn't take long to discover that he'd been far from the pious man his title suggested. Hensley had been implicated in several mob-led lynchings, though he was never charged. The land he purchased had become the site of a church, one that operated for decades, but had mysteriously burned down in the 1940s. The whispers grew louder as I read, and the air around me seemed to thrum with energy. This was the next link in the chain. Determined to find the site of the burned church, I drove back to the area near Tate Manor. The directions were vague, the road rough and overgrown, but I eventually found it: a clearing surrounded by tall, gnarled trees. The ruins of the church were barely visible, just a few charred beams jutting out of the earth. The place felt heavy, as if the land itself was weighed down by what had happened there. As I stepped into the clearing, the whispers surged, rising to a deafening crescendo. My vision blurred, and I fell to my knees, clutching my head. The world around me dissolved, and I was pulled into another vision. I was inside the church, but it wasn't in ruins. The pews were full, the air thick with tension. A group of men stood at the front, their faces shadowed, but their voices clear. They were preaching not of salvation, but of hate, rallying their congregation against the threat posed by freed Black families in the area. Among them was David Hensley, his voice booming as he stoked the flames of fear and anger. The vision shifted, fast-forwarding like a film reel. The same men, now outside the church, their faces lit by the flicker of torches. They marched toward a small house on the edge of the clearing, their intent clear. I tried to stop them, screaming at them to turn back, but my voice was swallowed by the night. The house went up in flames, the screams of its occupants tearing through the air. Hensley stood at the edge of a scene, his face impassive, as if watching a choreographed performance. When the vision ended, I was back in the clearing, my body trembling. The whispers had quieted, replaced by a single, resonant voice: the figure from the library. The sins were sanctified here, it said. The chain was tightened. You must loosen it. I didn't know what loosening the chain meant, but I couldn't walk away from what I'd seen. This wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about a broader legacy of injustice that had been perpetuated under the guise of righteousness. I began researching the church and its congregation, uncovering more about Hensley's role in the community. The records were sparse, many of them destroyed in the fire, but I managed to find a few surviving accounts in local newspapers and personal diaries. Hensley's sermons had fueled a reign of terror that spanned decades, targeting anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. I reached out to Elijah again, sharing what I discovered. He wasn't surprised. Hensley's name came up a lot in the stories my grandmother used to tell, he said. But we never knew the full extent of what he did. People didn't talk about it, not openly anyway. Together, we decided to hold another ceremony, this time at the site of the burned church. It wasn't just about acknowledging the victims of Hensley's hate, it was about reclaiming the space, turning it into a place of healing rather than pain. We worked tirelessly, organizing the event and reaching out to descendants of those who had been affected by the violence. The process was slow, and not everyone was willing to participate. Some wounds were too deep, too raw, even generations later. As the day of the ceremony approached, the whispers grew more frequent, their tone shifting from accusatory to almost pleading. The figure appeared in my dreams, its presence both comforting and ominous. "You are close," it said one night, its voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "But the chain is fragile. Be careful." The warning lingered in my mind as the day of the ceremony arrived. The clearing had been transformed, the ruins of the church surrounded by flowers and candles. Dozens of people had gathered, their faces a mix of sorrow and hope. Elijah spoke first, his words resonating with a quiet strength that moved everyone in attendance. When it was my turn to speak, I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "I came here to uncover the truth about my family," I began, my voice trembling. "What I found was so much bigger than me, bigger than any of us. The pain, the injustice, the hatred that happened here, it's not just history. It's a wound that we still carry, whether we realize it or not. But today, we have a chance to start healing." As I spoke, I felt a warmth spread through the clearing, as if the air itself had softened. The whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence that felt almost sacred. When the ceremony ended, people lingered, sharing stories and connecting in ways that felt deeply meaningful. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of lightness, as if a part of the burden had been lifted. But as I drove home that night, the figure's warning echoed in my mind. "The chain is fragile. Be careful." I had no idea what was coming next, but I knew this journey was far from over. The whispers might have quieted for now, but the weight of what remained unfinished loomed over me like a storm on the horizon. The days after the ceremony felt like walking on the edge of something vast and unknowable. The whispers had grown faint, almost non-existent, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I'd done enough. Maybe the chain had been loosened, the sins of the past given space to heal. But deep down, I knew better. The figure's warning echoed in my mind. The chain is fragile. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many shadows stretching back through time. And they were waiting for me. One night, the silence broke. I was lying in bed, caught between sleep and wakefulness, when the air in my room shifted. It wasn't a sound or a presence. It was an overwhelming feeling, like the weight of the library pressing down on me. My chest tightened as the whispers returned, louder than they had ever been, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. I clutched my head, trying to block them out, but they wouldn't stop. My vision blurred, and I was pulled back into the otherworldly archive. This time, the library was darker, the light from the shelves dim and flickering. The figure was waiting for me, its form more distinct than before. It no longer felt distant or untouchable. It felt human. "You've done well," it said, its voice steady but tinged with urgency. "But the chain is not yet broken. There is one final link." I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could ask what it meant, the books around me began to move. They floated from the shelves, swirling in a vortex of light and shadow. One book stopped in front of me, glowing with an intensity that made me shield my eyes. When I finally looked at it, I saw my name on the cover. My heart sank. I thought this was about my family, I said, my voice trembling. About the sins of the past. It is, the figure replied. But you are not only a witness, you are part of the chain. You must confront your own silence. Before I could ask what it meant, the book opened, and I was pulled into its pages. The vision was unlike anything I'd experienced before. I wasn't watching the past unfold. I was reliving it. I was back in my early years as a professor, standing in my office with a student named Michael. He was young, bright, and full of potential, but he'd come to me that day in tears, telling me about an incident where he'd been racially profiled by campus security. He wanted me to help, to speak out on his behalf. But I'd been too afraid of rocking the boat, too focused on my reputation and the politics of academia. I told him I couldn't get involved, that it wasn't my place. The memory hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd buried it for years, convincing myself it wasn't my responsibility. But now, standing in that moment again, I could see the pain in Michael's eyes, the way my silence had compounded his sense of isolation. The whispers grew louder, accusing and relentless, forcing me to confront the weight of my inaction. The vision shifted again, this time to a faculty meeting where I'd sat quietly as another professor made a dismissive comment about affirmative action. I hadn't spoken up then, either, even though I'd known it was wrong. The pattern was clear. I had spent my life avoiding conflict, refusing to take a stand when it mattered most. My silence wasn't just complicity, it was part of the very chain I was trying to break. When the vision ended, I was back in the library, my knees buckling under the weight of what I'd seen. The figure stood over me, its presence no longer comforting but piercing. You cannot undo the past, it said, but you can choose what comes next. I felt tears streaming down my face. How? I whispered. How do I fix this? How do I break the chain? The figure extended its hand, and the library dissolved around me. I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were gone, but their message was clear. The final link wasn't just about my ancestors, it was about me. My inaction, my silence, my willingness to look the other way when it was easier than standing up for what was right. The next morning, I called Emily. It wasn't just to hear her voice. It was to confess. I told her about the visions, about the weight of the chain I was carrying, and about the moments in my life where I had failed to do the right thing. She listened quietly, and when I finished, there was a long pause. I've always known you cared, she said softly, but I think you were afraid of what it would cost to show it. Her words stayed with me as I began to take the next steps. I reached out to Michael, the student I had failed all those years ago. He was surprised to hear from me, but he agreed to meet. Sitting across from him, I apologized, not just for my silence, but for the pain it had caused. He listened, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he simply nodded. It's not just about the apology, he said. It's about what you do next. Those words became my guide. Breaking the chain wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a different future. I began to speak out, to use the platform I'd spent my career cultivating to amplify voices that had been silenced. I collaborated with Elijah and his family on a project to document the stories of those affected by the violence perpetuated by people like Hensley. I worked with my university to create a scholarship fund in Samuel's name, dedicated to supporting descendants of those who had been oppressed. The whispers didn't return, but the weight of the chain was still there, reminding me that this work was far from over. One night, as I sat in my study, poring over the final details of the scholarship fund, I felt a presence in the room. It wasn't the oppressive weight of the whispers or the cold detachment of the figure. It was warm, almost peaceful. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Still, I felt it, a sense of quiet affirmation, as if the chain had loosened just a little more. I knew there would be more to face, more truths to uncover, and more work to do. But for the first time, I felt ready. The chain might never be fully broken, but link by link, I was learning how to carry it without letting it consume me. I thought I had reached the end of the journey. The scholarship in Samuel's name was established, the stories were being documented, and I had finally started to find peace in speaking out. But the whispers hadn't gone away completely. They were softer now, more like murmurs in the background, yet they tugged at the edges of my awareness. The figure hadn't appeared again, and part of me hoped it never would. But deep down, I knew there was one last step I hadn't taken, one final truth I needed to confront. The answer came to me one quiet evening as I sat in my study, flipping through an old journal I'd found in my mother's belongings after her death. Most of it was mundane, a record of daily chores, grocery lists, and little musings about her day. But tucked between the pages was a photograph I hadn't seen before. It was of a young black woman standing in front of Tate Manor, holding a child. Written on the back, in my mother's handwriting, were the words, Annalise and her son, James, 1925. The name jolted me. Annalise had come up in my research. She'd been one of the women enslaved on my great grandfather's plantation. Her story was largely unknown, but I'd come across fragments that suggested she had been a central figure in the community of enslaved people. But the child in the photograph, James, was new to me. None of the records mentioned him. The whispers grew louder as I stared at the picture, and I felt that familiar pull, the one that always led to something I couldn't ignore. I spent the next few days poring over every document I could find, chasing the thread of Annalise's story. What I discovered shocked me. James was her son, born on the plantation, but there was no record of his father. What the records did show was that he had been taken from her when he was just a boy, sold to a family in another state. There was no indication of what happened to him after that. Annalise had stayed on the plantation, living as a domestic servant long after emancipation, and she had died there, alone and forgotten. The figure's words echoed in my mind, restore what was stolen. James hadn't just been taken from Annalise. He had been erased. And now, decades later, it was up to me to bring his story back to light. The search for James consumed me. I contacted archivists, historians, genealogists, anyone who could help me trace his life. It was painstaking work, full of dead ends and false leads, but I refused to give up. The whispers became more insistent, guiding me toward the smallest details, as if the voices themselves were trying to piece together his story. Eventually, I found him, or what was left of him. James had lived a short, hard life, working as a sharecropper in Alabama. He married young, but his wife and their child had died in a house fire when he was just 32. He died a few years later, alone and destitute, buried in an unmarked grave. It was a heartbreaking end to a life that had begun with so much taken from him. I sat with that knowledge for days, unsure of what to do with it. What could I possibly do to restore what James had lost? His life was over, his story one of pain and loss. But then I thought of Annalise, of the way she had been left to mourn her son without answers, and I realized that the restoration wasn't just about James. It was about honoring both of them and ensuring that their stories were no longer hidden. I returned to Tate Manor, walking the grounds with a heaviness in my chest. The whispers were louder than they'd ever been, almost overwhelming. But as I stood in the clearing near the old cemetery, I felt something shift. The air grew still, and the world seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, I heard a voice, a single, clear voice cutting through the noise. Thank you. The words weren't spoken aloud, but I felt them as deeply as if they had been. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions, grief, relief, and something else I couldn't quite name. The whispers faded, leaving behind a profound silence that felt like the closing of a book. In the months that followed, I worked with Elijah and others to erect a memorial for Annalise and James on the grounds of Tate Manor. It wasn't much, just a simple stone marker with their names and a brief inscription, but it felt right. At the dedication ceremony, I spoke about their lives, about the injustice they had endured, and about the importance of remembering. It wasn't just for them. It was for everyone who had been silenced by history, their stories erased or ignored. It was for the generations that came after, so they would know the truth and carry it forward. As I stood there, Looking at the marker, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't known was possible. The chain wasn't gone, I knew that. It might never be gone, but it no longer felt like a weight pulling me under. It felt like something I could carry, something that had shaped me, but didn't define me. The whispers never returned after that day, and the figure from the library didn't appear again. But I felt their presence, not as a haunting weight, but as a quiet affirmation. They were still there, watching, but they no longer needed to guide me. I had found my own way forward. In the years that followed, I dedicated my life to uncovering and preserving stories like Annalise's and James's. I worked with communities to document their histories, to honor the lives that had been forgotten, and to ensure that the sins of the past were not repeated. It was exhausting, often thankless work, but it felt like a calling, a way to make sense of everything I had experienced. Emily and I grew closer during this time, our relationship transformed by my journey. She became one of my greatest allies, helping me navigate the difficult conversations and emotional toll of the work. Her faith and my newfound sense of purpose didn't always align, but we found common ground in the belief that what we were doing mattered. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much my life changed after that night in the hospital. I had started as a skeptic, someone who dismissed anything I couldn't see or prove. But now I knew better. I had seen the threads that connected us all, the ways our lives intertwined across time and space. And while I still didn't have all the answers about God, about the afterlife, about what lay beyond, I no longer needed them. It was enough to know that I had been part of something greater than myself, and that I had chosen to act. In the end, it wasn't just about breaking the chain. It was about learning how to carry it with grace, and in doing so, finding a kind of freedom I never thought possible.